Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us at this amazing event with a panel of experts. We are going to be discussing a lot of important issues around freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, right to participation in climate fora, and we are going to be discussing particularly the situation of human rights defenders, climate justice, and environmental defenders, and the participation of Indigenous people. So thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to this Zoom space. My name is Erika Guevara Rosas, and I'm the Senior Director for Research, Advocacy, Policy, and Campaign at Amnesty International, and I have the privilege to be moderating today's event. I know many of you have joined from many parts of the world. We cannot see, for the people who are on this side of the Zoom, we cannot see all the list of participants, and we cannot see your faces, but we really appreciate your interest and your participation in this event. We are going to be hearing from our expert panelists, and then we are going to open a space for your questions, your interventions, and we have our amazing colleagues from the Minority Right Group who are going to be helping us to collect all the questions and your comments so that we can also have some kind of interactive space in our event. And as I mentioned, we are going to be discussing how the shrinking of civic space is affecting particularly human rights, climate justice, and environmental defenders everywhere, but with a very specific focus on the climate fora and how the right to participation from civil society actors and Indigenous people at UN Climate Conference is becoming a big challenge in not only addressing some of the most fundamental existential challenges that we are facing as humanity, but also very important in how the crackdown against freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, the right to participation, the right to information is being used by many states to prevent from those who are speaking up, to prevent from those who are participating in finding solutions, and creating spaces of impunity where we continue to see how state actors and non-state actors continue to further increase the existential climate challenges that we are facing. And today's events, we are going to learn, to hear, to discuss from our expert panelists that I'm going to introduce very shortly on multiple challenges and restrictions of the civic space in this multilateral climate forum. We are going to hear from very specific examples of how these spaces are creating conditions to undermine the participation of civic actors, human rights defenders, climate justice defenders, environmentalist defenders, but also to hear very specifically about the experiences of Indigenous people and how they are also being challenged by this shrinking space in these spaces. We are going to hear, of course, some specific examples, but also we are going to hear from UN experts some alternative solutions of how we can move together, how we can mobilize together to address some of these issues. During the last years, Amnesty has documented numerous instances of human rights violations, particularly at COPs, including with regards to access in the COPs, and we've seen and witnessed ourselves in our own participation, how the crackdown against activists, against civil society actors, against Indigenous leaders is under such as Poland, Spain, the UK, Egypt, and most recently in the United Arab Emirates, is to undermine participation, but also to violate the rights of freedom of expression, of peaceful assembly. They are limiting the spaces where people can protest, where people can raise their voices. In many instances, participants have been removed from the negotiating spaces limiting the participation of civil society, but more importantly, limiting the possibility to inform society in general about these negotiations and how, unfortunately, the agreements being reached by the states are not addressing the existential challenge of climate change. We have already many organizations, including some that are participating here as speakers, but also those who are joining us in this Zoom event. We have highlighted the importance of certain space in these climate fora, including in the UNFCCC Blue Zones, and how these are becoming the centers of activism during these conferences. But unfortunately, we are also seeing how the authorities are limiting the space of participation, the lack of transparency, the lack of information, the lack of unclear processes, even within these centers of activism, are creating also a situation where activism is being prohibited, even including in this climate conference. But without further delay, let me introduce our expert panelists. We are very privileged today to have such a high quality of experts, but also of human rights defenders, climate justice defenders, environmental defenders who have dedicated their lives to continue the struggle for climate justice. So we are going to hear from Elisa Morguera. Elisa Morguera is the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change. She's also a professor of global environmental law at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in the UK. I mean, she has been a professor in multiple universities, centers of knowledge, and until recently, she directed the One Ocean Hub, a global North-South research collaboration on human rights and the ocean. From her, we are going to hear about the importance of civic participation and the civic space for climate action. We are also going to hear from Christine Candy, human rights defenders advocating for the rights of Indigenous women, girls, and people with disabilities. She's currently the executive director of Endorois, Indigenous Women Empowerment Network, an expert organization on intersectionality, persons with disability rights, minorities and Indigenous people rights. And from her, we are going to hear more about the experiences and the challenges faced by Indigenous people in their work defending land territories and participating in climate change spaces and conferences. Then we are going to hear from Arzu Heybula. She is an Azerbaijani columnist and journalist with a special focus in human rights and press freedom in Azerbaijan. And of course, we are going to hear more about, the challenges of the upcoming COP92, which is going to be hosted in Azerbaijan. Then we are going to hear from Emmanuel Schilchter. Apologies, Emmanuel, for not pronouncing well your last name. From Green Legal Impact Germany. Emmanuel is a fully qualified lawyer with an LLM in international law and international political economy from the University of Kent, and joined Green Legal Impact in 2023. From Emmanuel, we are going to hear more about the challenges that we are going to be facing at the Bonn Climate Conference that starts next week in Germany, in a context where crackdown against protest about climate is increasing. Then we're going to hear from Alfred Brownell from Climate Legal Defense. Alfred is an environmental and human rights lawyer and the lead campaigner and founder of Green Advocates International, a Liberian public interest law, environmental and human rights NGO that he founded in order to represent communities seeking to protect the environment and human rights. And we are going to hear from Alfred more about the legal repercussions of the participation and the limitations in participation in this climate forum. And lastly, I want also to welcome a dear friend of all of us, dear friend of Amnesty International, Michael Forst. He is the special rapporteur on environmental defenders under the Aarhus Convention, and we are also going to invite him for some reflections about the specific situations that environmental human rights defenders are facing. So as you can see, we have a wonderful group of experts, panelists, human rights defenders, climate justice defenders, who are going to discuss and explain many of the challenges, but also we are going to hear from participants any idea about how we can address these challenges. So I'm going to start then with Elisa. Elisa, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, I would just like to thank and honor all the environmental human rights defenders on the panel and those who are listening to us today for their work. I've been asked to reflect, first of all, on why civic space is important for climate action. And I think there are some important assumptions in the climate negotiation, but I think this is also true of other multilateral environmental negotiations that need to be brought to surface. Often we hear that climate solutions require social acceptability, and that has several problematic assumptions that decision makers and society operate separately from one another, and we assume that there'll be negative impacts without necessarily fully understanding who will be negatively impacted. So that kind of approach really shows a lack of understanding or a lack of awareness and commitment to the fact that climate change and the ineffective climate solutions have disproportionate human rights impacts. And they have those impacts, in fact, on those who are already facing several disadvantages and who should receive high priority in the discussions. So the really important space of civic space is actually allowing decision makers to come into contact and learn from the lived experiences of those human rights holders who are most affected by climate change, and the distinctive knowledge of Indigenous peoples, local communities, women, children and youth, persons with disabilities who not only have direct understanding of how climate change and climate solutions are ineffective and contribute to further injustices, but also in their daily life think and put into place solutions that could be so helpful for governments to develop those effective, policy coherent and legitimate solutions. And I think that dialogue is a dialogue where we need to allow space for concerns, for criticism, for genuine learning across those experiences, and making sure that the solutions are then not those that are only benefiting few, but in fact are very much solutions for everyone, and where we are able to protect the most vulnerable. That is also the highest level of protection that we can offer to everyone else. So I think that there's an important understanding of both the legal duties applicable that have been mentioned relating to civil and political human rights, but also the transformative potential of the exercise and protection of those human rights to really support more meaningful change in addressing climate change. I don't know if I should go to the next question, just reflecting very briefly about what are the major barriers in the context of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I think I can identify 3 problems. One problem may be more specific to the climate change negotiations. There may be other environmental negotiations, and that's a problem of scale. The number of people, organizations who have very important stakes to be represented in that forum is really staggering for important reasons. And I think there is an issue of how can the Secretariat and state parties really address that problem. However, that is not a justification for not finding ways and identifying problems that have been identified and solutions. To start with, even when I think the climate negotiations weren't as attracting as many numbers as they do today, there was still a relatively closer space compared to other multilateral environmental agreements. I've been attending for years the Convention on Biological Diversity negotiations, and there non-state actors have access to working groups, to contact groups, and these are spaces where there is a lot of learning from civil society, from indigenous peoples and local communities, from defenders. And secondly, what we see, and I think this is something that my predecessor had already very much underscored, is that a very neat separation between negotiations on the one hand and side events on the other, which clearly prevents that space for learning among all the participants. The second problem is a problem of not recognizing power and power differential. Most powerful actors are very present in the climate COPs and other negotiations, whereas the most vulnerable and their representatives are not necessarily so. And so there's a decision to be made around how to prioritize participation by the most vulnerable and their representatives, and how to regulate and limit participation by those representing most powerful interests. And the third problem is a problem of recognition. I think recognizing climate activists, youth representatives, indigenous peoples, and other constituents representatives as environmental human rights defenders for whom heightened levels of protection are required, I think is part of the barriers that needs to be addressed. The next question I had, but please do let me know if I should pause. And so then one interesting thing to discuss today, what is the role of the UN human rights mechanisms, such as special rapporteurs, but also the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights? How can we help in making those spaces more open? And I think there's three things that we are doing and can do. First is clarifying and calling attention to the fact that civic space is not a nice to have. It's not just a matter of ethics or good governance. It is a human rights issue that is subject to legally binding obligations for states, for UN organizations who are subject to the UN Charter, and a matter of responsibilities for business and civil society. Second, on the basis of that understanding, we can explore with states, with the UNFCCC Secretariat, and with business and others, how can those obligations be put in practice in a meaningful way in the context, and provide maybe an independent advice in that context, but also bridging with the views and the understandings coming from civil society and human rights holders directly. And finally, we are open to receive and address concerns and evidence of negative impact on human rights from human rights holders and defenders. And we are in a position to open a dialogue with states or UN bodies in how to address those. So I think these are all three things that, in fact, mutually interact with one another. It can help to both enhance the understanding of the importance and the obligations around civic space, but also work through the practical barriers, misconceptions, and difficulties to find concrete solutions. And so maybe that leads me to the next question that was addressed to me, which is, why is access to information and transparency so important in climate negotiations, and including in relation to the host country agreements? And of course, without information, there can be no meaningful participation. First of all, without being in the rooms where climate change measures are negotiated, it is very difficult to understand to what extent, if any, human rights are considered, respected, and protected, and therefore take action if that is not the case. But also without information, we can exercise our human rights. We can participate and genuinely support those decision-making process. But finally, without the information and without also the negotiators themselves not having an understanding and opportunities to work and hear directly from human rights holders, there's a whole body of evidence and distinct knowledge and understanding about the foreseeable negative impacts that certain proposed or even existing climate solutions can prevent on human rights. And that is where access to information means offering a basis for supporting duty bearers in complying with their international human rights obligations. And this is why it's in everyone's interest for the host country agreements to be made public, to make sure that there is an understanding about what the governments hosting a COP will do in terms of identifying and addressing any legislation at the national level that may limit the space for freedom of expression, association, and assembly in the country, to make sure that any staff working in and around the COP, including at airport and entry points, is trained around protection of human rights and protection of environmental human rights defenders, and preventing any form of intimidation, harassment, and surveillance, both during the COP, but importantly also after the COP and after the heightened attention maybe has moved on. And we need to see also what are the heightened protections that will be put in place for child defenders, and what measures of restraints will be put in place to ensure that peaceful protest and expressions of opinion will be allowed within and outside of the COP. There's also a really important matter in terms of looking into the chilling effect that current practices and potentially even attacks on environmental human rights defenders happening before the COP may have on human rights holders and their representatives in preparing or even deciding not to attend, or feeling a need to self-censor in their participation. And so all of this needs to be part of that agreement and part of the information that is released for everyone to be aware about how those human rights have been taken into account, what measures have been in place, and be able to and feel confident in the opportunity to exercise those human rights that contribute to effective, fair, and long-lasting climate solutions.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Thank you for this. And I know that we had a lot of questions that we were intended you to respond in 8 minutes, but you did a wonderful work. Thank you very much, Elisa, for that. And I'm sure that our participants may have questions and comments that we are going to hear after the presentation. So then I'm going to ask Christine Candy. I think it was unmuting and we cannot see the video.
Hello.
Hi, Christine. How are you?
Yes, I'm fine. So sorry, I'm trying to fix video on my laptop. There's a problem, and that is why you could hear somebody speaking at the background. We are trying to fix it. I hope it will be able to work. So thank you so much. I think this is my time to provide my views. I'm Christine Candy. I'm the executive director of an organization that is an expert in intersectionality. That is Endoro's Indigenous Women Empowerment Network. We are based in Kenya, and we mobilize the voices of Indigenous people, women, people with disability, youth, and elderly. We are provided a safe space whereby Indigenous knowledge, including even struggle for land rights, is able to be passed from one generation to another. We are also battling with the issues of climate change. And one of the issues about climate change is the rising water of Lake Bogoria. So Lake Bogoria has been our ancestral home until when the government of Kenya evicted us for conservation reasons. And with this, we've lost a lot of things, including even our strong relationship with our nature, Mother Nature. And we've also experienced a lot of marginalization, including even the voice of women and people with disability. So currently we are using advocacy, we research, and including even education to advance our agenda. So in regards to the question that I've been asked to address about climate change, is that what are the challenges faced by Indigenous people in their work, defending access to land and other people's rights in relation to climate change impact, and what can state can do about it? So one of the challenge is about self-organizing. We've been struggling as Indigenous people for a long time to be identified, including even at the local level. For example, in the Royce community, there are long struggle for their land rights. And this recognition has to, take our struggle. We had to go to African Commission for such recognition, despite having United Nations declaration that really respect for our rights. We've seen state continue violating for our rights. For example, we have the issues of carbon credit, carbon market, and carbon discussion. That is, as seen our indigenous land being declared as a conservation areas, being declared as a water tower area. For example, the Mau, where Okiek live in Kenya, has been a targeted place as a conservation areas, and for other carbon credit market and discussion at around country level. So this in itself has continued to marginalize us as indigenous people. Another challenge that we face is about accessing negotiation at the UNFCCC, for example. As we speak, there is this international frameworks and convention that guides on how resolution and decision are made at the Bonn, Germany, for example. So how indigenous people access those platforms? Do we have deliberate effort to support indigenous people to also participate on those international negotiation forums? Do they really understand how to negotiate? What are the things that they should be taking forward? Do we have a deliberate support in building their resilience and building their adaptation? How do they document such good practice, and how those practice inform part and parcel of national and international adaptation plans? For example, we do understand that at the national level, our government is required to provide on an annual basis national adaptation plan, and they also do something called global stock taking. This is a very ambitious plan that government bring forward to the UNFCCC discussion and caucuses. How do we ensure that such discussions capture the resilience and adaptation, including the real practice of what is happening at the ground? We've had this challenge of operation at the higher level that cannot speak to the issues and needs of the people at the lower level. I think for practice to take place is that we are supposed we are supposed to take the issues, the practical part of the issues from the ground. Another thing is about accreditation at the UNFCCC and even the UN and even other COP processes. How do we ensure that organizations, especially organizations with person with disabilities, organizations of women, organizations of indigenous group, are able to receive accreditation and even offer support to their members to participate in those conversations? I've also talked about issues of the leadership of communities receiving continuous threats, and even to an extent of their losing their life in the process of protecting their life. So those are the threats that we receive, and including even challenges that we face as indigenous people. Another challenge is about how our programs, or even how do we support their programs so that they can build power below in terms of how they can continue building their resilience. How do they continue practice ambitious work, like for example, restoration? How do they ensure that they don't lose a very important component of guardianship and indigenous knowledge stewardship? How do they contribute to those international ambition plan? How do we support them so that they continue, even if they face threats of climate change or even other threats? How do they build themselves along with those challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis? So I think I've captured on what what are the challenges, and in regards to specific challenges that indigenous people face in participating in UNFCCC and COP meetings is about getting funding to support their groups, because we've had this scenario whereby you get an individual leader from an organization or even from a community participating in those discussions. How do we ensure that we have an inclusive representation on those spaces? Because in UNFCCC discussion, including even COP, we have those spaces for people with disabilities. We have those spaces for women. We have those spaces for leadership. We have also spaces for the government. How do we ensure that we build on those spaces and those spaces speak to our needs? How do we ensure? Because even the language itself, even how do we communicate about those what is happening in UNFCCC in the language that can be understood with our local community, including even people with disabilities that have experienced historic marginalization in every process that is taking place. So that is one of the challenges that I think we are facing. Another thing that indigenous community we are facing is about documentation. How do we? There is this component of San Diego network loss and damage funding. Currently, as an organization, we are leading the process of doing loss and damage for how do we establish those loss and damage? How do our conversation be part of national discussion? How do we ensure that those indigenous-led research and establishment of loss and damage are really qualified and even receive accreditation or even recognized to be part, and how do communities receive those funding that equate to the loss they have suffered, and these loss are caused by climate change? How do we ensure that voices of women are also part and parcel of negotiation? So those are the kind of questions that they're really missing in this space, and it's very critical for us, and it is very critical to build a very, we need to have a solution that speaks to our needs. And when we say solution that speaks to our needs, we should also try to look around and ensure that everyone is inclusive in the process that we establish those discussions. So what can be done is generally about having opening up space for everyone. We've been working in silos, like those discussion is happening. The calendars of how do we ensure that those discussion can be made, can be made to happen at the local spaces? How do we build the power of women? How do we build their leadership so that at the national level, they're also critiquing or even contributing to the government, so that there is no overburdening of even the government action? For example, borrowing loan at international space that in return has a lot of overburdening, and even, they have normalized on those processes. So how do we build women power and people with disabilities, and including indigenous people, to be able to provide accountability framework to their government, including even the decisions that they make at international space? So those are very critical issues that we need, it needs to be improved, and even to offer continuous support to indigenous people and to persons with disabilities. So generally, we also continue to face climate change impact, even as we speak now, even as we have this international negotiation taking place. How do we ensure that we provide a solution to current issues that people are facing, so that they will have, energy to be able to provide or even contribute to those international frameworks? So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I think I have answered this question to the best of my capability. I'm sorry, my video cannot be like, there is some technical problem with my laptop. So yeah, I wish you can share a better part of Stephanie. You can share my photo for people to see.
Thank you, Christine, dear. Thank you very much, and all our solidarity. Thank you. Yes, no, you answer not only the questions, but you gave us a very good, a very devastating picture of all the challenges that are being faced in these spaces, with a very with the intersectionality lens, to understand not only the experience of indigenous people, but also the experience of people with disability, and the access limits that you are all facing. Thank you, dear Christine. And just a reminder to our participants that you can write your questions, your comments in the question and answer panel that you have at the bottom of your screens. So our colleagues are collecting those, so we can have some interaction with our panelists at the end of the presentations. And now I'm going to ask Arzu Heybula. Arzu is joining us from Istanbul. She is a columnist and journalist who is going to speak us a little bit more about the challenges as we are preparing for COP29 in Azerbaijan. So Arzu, can you unmute? Yes, thank you, Arzu.
Hi, hello. Thank you for having me here today. Before I begin my intervention, I would just like to make a quick note. I'm speaking today in two capacities: as an independent journalist, as you've already mentioned, but also as Azerbaijan researcher at Human Rights Watch. And I'm joining today actually not from Istanbul, but Berlin, given my travel schedule. So yeah, as you mentioned, you've asked me to talk a little bit to the situation with human rights in the country at the moment, but also ahead of COP and what to expect from the host country of this year's COP 29. You know, by my fear as a journalist, but also as someone who's been documenting the situation in the country for a number of years now, is that by the time Azerbaijan hosts COP 29 in November, there may not be any independent or impartial civil society left. While the country was never really a bastion of human rights and freedoms, and have often ranked poorly on global rights and freedoms and freedom indices, what we have been witnessing in the country since summer 2023, is a new wave of crackdown against civil society and civic groups. We've seen arrests on bogus charges of political and civic activists, labor rights activists, journalists, and human rights defenders. Since November 2023, specifically, over 20 journalists have been rounded up, some from well-known and established media platforms, independent opposition media platforms, others from lesser-known regional media platforms. Most of these journalists are charged with smuggling, a new popular criminal offense leveled against these individuals. And the crackdown that we've been witnessing in Azerbaijan has preceded the decision to hold the snap presidential election in the country in February of this year. Normally, the elections were scheduled for next year. As a result, to say that the election in February, on February 7th, took place in an environment of impunity, fear, intimidation, would not be an understatement. President Ilham Aliyev secured a 5th consecutive term with 92% of votes, but these elections were neither free nor were they fair, as all previous elections in Azerbaijan since the country's independence, or since the Aliyev family took over the leadership of the country. Needless to add that President Ilham Aliyev really had no meaningful challengers in this election. Out of 7 candidates, including Aliyev himself, there were no independent candidates. Most of the candidates were either affiliated with the ruling party or other political parties, but who still had ties with the ruling party. They were not real opposition, as the government claimed it to be. President Aliyev never actually joined any of the public debates in which 6 other candidates discussed and, in fact, praised President Ilham Aliyev's policies and all of the achievements that the country has achieved over the course of his presidential powers. And as it was stated by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Observer Mission, the February 7 election was devoid of genuine pluralism. There is now a talk to have parliamentary elections earlier than they were scheduled, ahead of COP29. So we'll see when the date is announced. The only independent election observation group that has been in the country, that has been observing elections for many years, they have been targeted in the most recent crackdown that we've seen and been documenting since November. The head of this organization, the Election Monitoring and Democracy Study Center, Anar Mamali, he is a well-known political activist and civic activist and HRD. He was arrested under the same bogus charges of smuggling as we've seen happen and leveled against other journalists and critics. Shortly in the same time period when Mammadli was arrested, another civic activist who was first barred from leaving the country, detained at the airport as he was trying to leave the country and then taken to the police and later arrested, Imran Aliyev. He's the founder of an online platform called Mejlis Info, a platform that documents statements of members of the parliament. He's also been pressed with the same charges of smuggling. Other platforms have been targeted, platforms like fact-checking, Fact.Yokhla website, the only fact-checking platform that we have in Azerbaijan. The director of that platform, Akif Kurbanov, has also been sent behind bars as part of this crackdown, and the list goes on. So this is what I mean when I say that by the time Azerbaijan hosts COP29, there may not be any civil society left, precisely because there are so many different actors who have been targeted in the run-up to COP29. Now, all of these individuals have been placed in pretrial detention, and the local courts thus far continue consistently to extend these detention periods. Most recently in the case of several journalists who were arrested in the run-up to the presidential election between November and February. Scores of individuals, journalists, freelance writers who've been affiliated with these platforms in this or that capacity have also been called in for questioning on multiple times as part of the ongoing investigation. Meanwhile, President Ilham Aliyev, while answering to a question about the unlawful treatment and the wave of arrests in taking place in Azerbaijan just last month in Berlin, said that all of these arrests were lawful, dismissing international criticism and dismissing all of the calls for release of these people and other political prisoners in the country. Yes, it is true that following an immense and consistent international pressure, a well-known academic and anti-corruption expert, Gubadoglu, has been released from prison, but he's been released under house arrest, and celebrating his transfer from prison to an open-air prison is naive. Professor Badoglu continues to face the same charges, and the investigation is ongoing. None of this is new, however. The crackdown against Azerbaijani independent voices and critics have been in practice for decades, throughout the time that the ruling family has been in power in the country. As such, it is not surprising to see the list of political prisoners in the country continue to grow. By some accounts of local civic groups, the number is approaching 300 people. Now, what kind of impact does this have? The environment, the overall situation that I've just described puts everyone who is involved in civic space and civic work in potential danger and at risk. While there is a handful of environmental activists in the country, they tread carefully, knowing that a very small mistake in the form of an open criticism of the authorities or certain government institutions could land them in trouble. I'll just give you one example. When the country witnessed environmental protests against toxic waste from an open cast gold mine operated by a company in one of the villages in the country, there was the protest broke out as a result of the company's interest in building a second artificial lake near the first one, but there was quite a significant environmental impact on the local village residents, and so mass protests broke out, and the state cracked down. They sent in riot police. A lot of the village residents were threatened. They faced violence by the police, and strangely enough, the president of COP29, who was at the time of the protest the Minister of Ecology and Environment, didn't really say much about the protest, and he only really spoke when President Ilham Aliyev actually criticized the ministry for the lack of their oversight in not paying attention to the toxic waste of the company that was involved in this village, or in general for lack of measures. I'm told I have very little time left, so I'm actually going to really kind of push through this and perhaps answer some of the questions later, but I just want to focus on what we can and what other states can do to improve the situation. COP29 could be an opportunity for international guests to raise concerns with the government of Azerbaijan, with local groups and activists, which local groups and activists cannot do on their own. Press the host government to allow civil society to demand and scrutinize climate action before, during, and after the conference. Press the host government to ease its grip on civic space and respect its human rights obligations by upholding the rights to free expression, association, and protest. The Azerbaijani authorities should immediately and unconditionally release all those arbitrarily detained for their exercise of the rights to free expression ahead of COP29. The UNFCCC member states should emphasize the importance of thriving and independent civil society to demand ambitious climate action, and press the government of Azerbaijan publicly and privately to respect its human rights obligations and immediately and unconditionally once again release arbitrarily detained journalists, activists, and human rights defenders. UNFCCC should make the host agreement it is expected to sign with Azerbaijan public and ensure that it complies with international human rights law. The UN should set human rights criteria for future COP hosts, including an obligation to realize the rights to freedom of speech and assembly that are preconditioned to ensure ambitious climate outcomes. The Secretariat should also press the government of Azerbaijan to respect its human rights obligations to signal its intention to facilitate robust and rights-respecting climate negotiations before, during, and after COP29. Thank you, and apologies for going over time.
No, on the contrary, thank you very much. I know that it's such a short period of time to give us an overall perspective of the situation and what like the activists, the civil society participants are going to be facing in the context of a very, very dire human rights situation. So thank you very much for doing it in such a short time, Arzu, and congratulations on your new position at Human Rights Watch. So now I'm going to pass to Emmanuel from the Green Legal Impact in Germany, as we are also in next week, we are starting the Bonn Climate Conference, and it will be also important to understand the situation in Germany in relation particularly to the right to protest. We know that the climate fora is also an important space by human rights defenders, by activists, to highlight the situation in many other parts of the world. And we know that we are now confronting a very serious war on Gaza and the devastating consequences that have also a lot of connection to climate. So, but in any way, no, I'm not going to go there, but particularly to the situation of protest in Germany, if you can talk more about what's happening there and how you envision that the shrinking of the civic space, the repression against protest is going to have a major effect on people participating in the Bonn Climate Conference. Emmanuel?
Yeah, thank you very much, Erika. I will give a brief overview over the developments in Germany, and then I will try to give a small expectation what we have for the Bonn Climate Change Conference that will be next week, where Germany will push for higher ambitions for climate change, against climate change internationally. However, we see in Germany that the repressions are rising against climate change activists that exactly demand what Germany demands internationally. And we see their ambivalent action of the government, and that also is considerably undermining the trust internationally if they go harsher and harsher against climate activists. So we see different international organizations and German organizations that are very concerned about the developments that are in Germany, because we see not as much of not-existent spaces like in Azerbaijan, as we just heard, but we see that there are movements in a certain direction where we already have to raise our voices as civil society and have to say, okay, we don't want to have the civic spaces being closed and shrinking. So, for example, the German Institute of Human Rights says that Germany is not fulfilling its human rights obligations due to restrictions, especially on the climate movement. Then Amnesty International, your organization, also lists Germany for the first time where freedom of assembly is increasingly restricted, especially again because of the actions against climate activism. Then we have Human Rights Watch as well being concerned. We have Michel Forst, who will probably elaborate a little bit more on his position, and then our views that we published in our Green Legal Spaces report, where we see and define the different aspects of the repression in Germany. There are various, of course, the civic space is large, and we have administrative restrictions from especially assembly authorities. We have stigmatization, which is coming from the media, but also the political realm that legitimizes criminalization and also legitimizes actions from other actors against climate activists. We have physical harassment, especially from the police. We have the spaces of dialogue that are under pressure online and offline. We hear a lot from climate activists that are expressing their opinions online and then getting a lot of hate, also in the form of letters and threats, and especially also now the concerning developments of criminalization. So especially we talk to lawyers and other organizations in Europe, and when we tell them that pain grips are normalized in Germany and that criminal organization is being threatened against activists and also preventive detection, they are very surprised that in Germany that is a normalized measure of the state. For example, in Austria, that is certainly not the case, where pain grips would lead to a public outcry. In Germany, pain grips are completely normal, being used against climate activists. So I want to highlight especially 2 points, the pain grips and the accusation of a criminal organization in Germany, which are very disturbing and very being criticized because of also human rights aspects. So pain grips is a method of the police to inflict pain through overbending the arms or using pressure points at activists that are peacefully assembling or getting to an assembly, and they use those measures to bring the activists from one point to another, which is also very disputed in the legal realm because of its disproportionality and human rights concerns. Even it might be considered as torture because it is a measure that only is there to inflict pain. And usually the police can use different measures against these peaceful protesters because they don't use violence against the police. And the police is using that to threaten activists, to deter activists, to engage in peaceful protest. And it is, of course, also working so that activists are not being engaged anymore that much, that they are scared to go to protests and that they don't want to be a victim of these pain grips. And the other very concerning development is the development of the accusation of a criminal organization. We have the Last Generation, which is a climate movement, which has done a lot of road blockades in Germany, but also for a short period of time closed down gas pipelines a year or two ago. And because of those actions, last week, the prosecutors brought charges against 5 people of the Last Generation to criminalize their association to bring civil disobedience and their political opinion into the public discourse. And certainly those individual criminal offenses can be followed, but criminalizing a movement that is there to peacefully protest and engage in the public discourse is an escalation of the repression in Germany. And this is of big concern because not only those victims and accused people of the Last Generation are going to be under scrutiny, but also everybody who supports them. People who maybe gave them some money in support, some legal advice, etc. Those people may be criminalized, and that is something that is actually being used normally against gangs, against mafia, and now it is being utilized against political activists and political opponents. And that is something that we must fight and must raise concerns about. And we really appreciate the help of anybody, also internationally, to raise their voices and say that this is an escalation and this should not be in the political discourse, and that it is very concerning. So to come to the last point, what do we expect in Bonn? We are not sure. We talked to a lot of people in Bonn, a lot of activists, a lot of lawyers that are known there, and we don't know what to expect. Usually at those climate conferences in Germany, there is not a lot of police repression occurring. However, we see that there is a climate camp that is being built, and in those instances, there might be more repressions, especially now if there are pro-Palestine activists from international countries coming, and that the police is very being repressive at pro-Palestine demonstrations in Germany. They use, again, pain grips. They use preventive detention against activists that are pro-Palestine, and it is a very brutal measure from the police. And maybe one advice or thing to be aware of as an international activist at the conference is that, for example, different slogans are being considered as difficult from the police. So the police will go against you, such as "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and everything which is regarding to the Intifada. So that is something that I would be careful to use in Germany. And certainly it will be something where the police will go a bit more with repressions if there's pro-Palestine protests. And anyhow, I hope that it will be peaceful, that the police will not be repressive, and hope that the activists can express their freedom of opinion. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And it seems that the situation in Germany sounds quite difficult and for participation. So it's not that different of Azerbaijan, although of course understanding the different context, the different challenges, but it sounds quite alarming. And thank you for your presentation on this. And I'm sure some of our participants may have comments and questions. So now I'm going to go to Alfred from the Climate Legal Defense. Alfred has been providing legal support to climate movements, networks, alliances, to climate youth activists, people attending climate fora, particularly participating at COP, but most recently he's also providing legal advice to participants at the Bonn Climate Conference. So thank you for joining us, Alfred, and we would love to hear more about your work, but also some of the advice that you are giving to all these climate activists and participants to climate conferences and fora. Alfred?
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to really express my thanks and appreciation for inviting me to be part of this incredible panel and this really thoughtful and valuable conversation about the situation of climate activists and climate defenders, especially concerning the issue of the civic space. So I'm the founding president of the Global Climate Legal Defense Network. At the Global Climate Legal Defense Network, we provide legal support, legal advice, coordination, and funds for legal defense, and we strengthen the community of diverse lawyers and legal organizations to serve the climate movements. Why we do this is because we learn now that governments and fossil fuel companies are actually weaponizing the law to silence and criminalize dissent. And we've seen that the more successful that climate defenders are, the more we're seeing the harassment of defenders, the more we're seeing they've been sued, they've been investigated, and they've been detained. And while fossil fuel companies have all of the best lawyers and are lawyering up, we are seeing that climate defenders are lucky if they can even find lawyers, much less the money to pay for them. And that is the reason why at CLADEF, the Global Climate Legal Defense Network, we decided to respond to this, to provide legal advice and strategy. We fund the lawyers and the legal NGOs, and we coordinate cases, including matching defenders with the right lawyers. We strengthen and connect a global legal network to build a legal bench for climate movement across the globe. So it is on the basis of that work we do that we decided 2 years ago to start offering some services and support at CAPS. And our CAP work, which is the CAP Legal Protection and Safety Program, focuses on what we call the before, the during, and the after. We try to focus on activists who are coming from a number of countries that we refer to as hotspot countries. And it is in these countries we believe that there's serious amount of repression, and there's very closed civic spaces for defenders to be able to engage in any sort of activities around CAP. So even if they have not gone to the CAP, but they're organizing events, they tend to face reprisals. So we marked a couple of those countries where we're seeing, I guess, the passage of very restrictive and draconian laws that prohibit and impede the rights of activists. 15 years ago or 10 years ago, one would say the focus was just in the so-called developing, the so-called certain countries. But as we're seeing now, the front line has actually come right in our back door, in our backyard. We're seeing places where you've never ever imagined the evolution of very restrictive laws. And I think part of what I want to add here, and I don't know what many folks have organized, this is part of a pattern. Many years, those who were involved in climate denials, those who had challenged the science of the climate crisis, now they cannot raise those issues anymore because we are no more talking about the science. You just have to walk outside of your door to see what is going on. So what have they done? They focus their attention on the defenders who are involved in trying to create more awareness, more visibility, more understanding of this situation. And so we're seeing now that they, in essence, are trying to find a way to capture the CAP spaces. And this is more and more why we believe that the shrinking civic spaces and the ability to access what's going on CAP. So our program before is focusing on that. We organize, first we prepared training materials called a Know Your Law Guide, where we educate the activists about what the laws are in the country, what are the do's and don'ts. And then we organize webinars where we bring activists to talk about the situation in the particular country, the political context, the human rights situations. And then we try to deploy other observers or recruit lawyers who are on the ground to monitor what's going on. And if there's any issues concerning reprisals or the attack or debadging, we are able to respond to them to try to find a way to help them. And then there's the after the CAP, because we see situations where activists who have come to CAP, they have made statements, they are on panel, they get involved in events and demonstrations, and then they return home and they have problems. We have situations in the past, in Pakistan, in Uganda, in Tanzania, where we have to respond to provide protection for the activists. And so on the basis of that, in Dubai, at COP28, we actually have a whole team to really monitor and document, because we thought it's important to see exactly what is this space that the activists were really trying to access. And we organized a whole documentation process where we conducted a series of interviews to really observe what was going on. And we are developing a report. We are working on a report that's going to be issued hopefully late July, early August, that really look at civil society and activist engagement and participation and accessing of the CAP space. And we have some very preliminary data and information that we feel that have come out of that that work. So, for example, there are things that we are seeing. I will just probably run you through a few of the things that we actually have seen that our report is picking up. So, first is that we observe that within the CAP space, where activists are participating, there's very unclear and increasingly tight demonstration rules, very unclear coordination with the host country. We're seeing increased surveillance. We see there's no defined process for reprisals before, upon, and during CAP. And we're also seeing the absence of a right-friendly framework for civil society at CAP. We're seeing very pervasive censorship of civil society by the Secretariat itself. We've seen a lack of transparency concerning host country commitments. Most of you have talked about the host country agreement. We've seen a lot of issues around that. We've seen inadequate monitoring of reprisals and intimidations. Reprisals both in terms of what activists face when they are in their home country, what activists face when they are at the CAP space, and how to document that. And we also, for example, we took a very serious look at what happened in the UAE. So, for example, those of you who went to COP28, I mean, if you just look at just the environment, the sprawling grounds, the intimidating security presence, the unclear rules that were there, the chilling effect that folks face, the tactic control speech and demonstration, and also the surveillance. Digital surveillance was such a very huge issue that we really observed on what we thought this is about. And so we are really hoping, that first and foremost, concerning the CAP, we are hoping that the host agreement, as most of you have said, that is actually made publicly available and that incorporate very clear standards on the protection of free speech and association. We're also hoping that the UN guidelines, and this is an area where sometimes folks don't talk about, they have these guidelines, they are very opaque, they are not clear, there's no consistency, and they are based on a case-by-case basis on the interpretation of the Secretariat. We hope that they need to promote full and free speech in these sort of guidelines. We are hoping, for example, that the CAP space could really encourage the recognition, protection, and the inclusion of defenders, that they don't just come and become observers, but be a part of the negotiation process. We are hoping, for example, that there will be a lot more inter-collaboration between UN agencies. We are hoping that the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, hoping that UNEP and the CAP space can really share a lot more, and they are able to engage. We are also hoping, for example, for improved reporting system. So if there's reprisals and it's reported, there's clear documentation. So there's a need that that reports are publicized that have been filed in the past, and that responses that are given to complaints, that those responses are actually made available and published. That's CAP specific. We hope we can recommend that actually the establishment of an ombudsman or an ombudsman procedure to enforce the protection provided by the UNFCCC the Code of Conduct. I was asked also to say, look, we've organized this event at CAP 27, CAP 28. We are going to organize the same event for CAP 29. But I think the question was, why are you also organizing similar kind of training for Germany? I think the previous speaker, spoke well about this issue about why we have decided that we thought it's important to be able to focus our attention on Germany. As I spoke earlier on at the Bonn climate meeting, a lot of the concern has been we focus on CAP in countries that we feel have very close civic spaces. But over and over, many of the activists who are going to Bonn, especially those from the Global South who've been involved, for example, in protest action, in ceasefire campaign and other stuff, feels that they wouldn't have a very safe space. And so we decided to organize, along with a number of different organizations, the CAP Legal Protection Program for the civic space. Right, the CAP legal protection. And so the idea was to build a holistic resilience of climate defenders and other constituency members attending the Bonn conference, and to reduce their exposure to physical and legal and digital risks by emboldening them to pursue protest activities without fear of retaliation, particularly in relationship to any Palestinian solidarity action. And we laid out a couple of objectives that we thought that this would achieve. One, to provide the defenders and the constituency members with the knowledge that they need to prevent, mitigate, or respond to any physical, legal, or digital threats and conduct in the context of their activities around SB 60, to build awareness of the local context in Germany and of escalating threats against the Palestinian and climate activists based on the experience of pro-Palestinian organizations in Germany, and then to build the visibility of the existing support network and mechanisms, such as, the colleague who spoke and others, to provide guidance on what to do in the event of legal problems. And this was why we organized those processes. And during that webinars, we were able to provide a lot of information. We had experts who spoke about the German legal context, how threats have been escalating against climate activists, with various issues on advice on organizing protests and mitigating risks, the issues about solidarity protests, hate crime, concerns about wearing the kafir, and other acts of harassment and organizational liability, among others. I have been asked to talk about—
Alfred, I'm going to ask you, I'm sorry to interrupt, that we need to start wrapping up. Thank you, Alfred.
Okay, so then I was just trying to conclude that. So the question I was going to ask about what can we show about open civic space at the UNFCCC in Bonn? Given what I said, for example, there are a couple of things that we could look at. One, consistency and clarity on the UNFCCC guidelines. Two, the publication and transparency associated with the host country agreement. Three, make sure that defenders are actually included in the negotiations, that countries actually will encourage that more defenders are on country delegations, and they are coming and they are able to engage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alfred, and thank you for the amazing work that you are all doing. And I'm sorry I have to interrupt you because I'm mindful of the time, and we wanted to have more interaction with our participants. Some of you have already sent your questions, and some of our panelists have been, typing some of the responses, but hopefully we will have a few minutes so that everybody can hear some of the responses. But we have the privilege to have Michael in the event, so I would love to give you the floor, dear Michael, if you can give us some reflections on what you have heard, and also more important, what's your kind of, what's keeping you awake in relation to the attacks that environmental human rights defenders are facing. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Erika, and I'll try to be brief because I know that time is very short. So just I wanted to say that it's a very good initiative taken by Amnesty to organize this panel discussion, because we know that we have before us a very complicated COP29 in a very complicated country, in which I did a couple of years ago an official mission, and there was a report which was discussed at one of the sessions of the council, and hearing what Arzu was describing today, I mean, that confirmed that nothing has changed in the country. And after COP in Egypt, COP in the Emirates, COP in Azerbaijan will be the same continuum, in fact. We were, a few of us in Dubai, Alfred was there, and I do remember discussing with Agnes Kalama the risk faced by Amnesty, by herself and other defenders, if we were trying to simply say the name of Ahmed Mansour, like in the example, or the names during COP meetings. We had no information on what was in the security measures in the host agreement, no information on what would happen, who would be then responsible for security, for myself and for others who would try to provide at least names of defenders that are currently facing prison facing prison in Dubai. As Alfred and others said, we are missing information, and what is striking is the lack of effective, meaningful participation of defenders in those areas. We very well remember that in Sharm el-Sheikh, but also in Dubai, many of defenders were prevented to have an access to visas. We are facing, or they were also facing, reprisals in many countries. And I'm also very concerned because my mandate has a very great focus on public participation in international fora. That's a key component of my mandate. And we have at the Aarhus Convention what we call a task force to promote public participation. And that's why I'm insisting on in my discussion with member states to provide security to defenders when they want to have an access to those international fora. Since I've been elected to my mandate 1 year ago, I've been traveling extensively to meet with defenders in more than 20 countries. I did organize 4 regional consultations in which I invited many defenders to meet with me, hundreds of defenders. I'm doing consultations in Africa, in Benin in September, in Latin America, in Bogota in September as well. And what I hear in those consultations is always the same, in fact. Complaints on COP, not only COP climate, but also COP biodiversity. What they say is that, Michel, they are discussing our daily life. They are discussing our future. They're discussing the future of planet, and we are not inviting to set the table, nor before, not during the COP meetings, and after, when it comes to the implementation of decision taken at COP meetings, they are not inviting us to discuss, so we are left without any information. And that's a big issue for me, to make sure that we would promote participation of defenders in those fora. As already explained, the main concern for me is the host agreement between UNFCCC and the host country, which, as Alfred was pointed out, need to be disclosed. At least something would be explained on what's happening in terms of security during those COP meetings. And that's why, together with a group of organizations, with Allied, and Alfred is a part of this, with Global Witness, Ford, ECNL, and others, and myself, who are trying to promote another way to approach those COP meetings. And we try to gain the support of global leaders to make commitments on the participation of indigenous people and also defenders to those COP meetings. We need to find allies. We need to find member states that would support us to demonstrate that COP meetings can and will be organized in a more participative manner, in fact. We have already had good discussions with Colombia prior to COP16 in Cali, good discussion in Brazil. We spent 1 week in Brazil together with a group of NGOs, and Alfred was also there, meeting with the government to discuss COP30 in Brazil. And we hope that at least Brazil and Cali would set precedents for future COPs, like COP31 in Australia. And that would be maybe the first 2 COPs in which things would happen in a more positive manner. So let's hope that those 2 COPs at least will be different from others. And the last point of information is that I'm organizing in Paris in October what we call the intermechanism meeting, a meeting by which I invite all the special rapporteurs dealing with human rights defenders. That is the UN Special Rapporteur, the Special Rapporteur of the African Commission, the Special Rapporteur of the Inter-American Commission, Council of Europe, and OSCE to discuss together. And the topic of the discussion will be protection of environmental defenders inside COP meetings. So hopefully we'll come together with a concrete set of guidance tool to guide states on how to promote participation of defenders in those forums. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for those reflections and for sharing all this information. And we've been receiving some questions from our participants, and some of our panelists are already answering to those questions in writing. I hope everybody has access to that and you can see, but I still have a few questions and I'm mindful of the time. You know, my apologies for not going through all the questions so that we can have a more open conversation, discussion with our panelists. But there are 2 important questions that I would like to ask to our panelists. One of the questions have been already answered in some way, but it would be great to hear from other panelists. So this question comes from Ryan from our sister organization, International Accountability Project. And it is related to donors, right? Donors that provide financial support to people to participate in these climate conferences, and some donors that also provide you know, financial support to the host countries. But let's focus on the ones who provide support to participants. So what is your message for those donors? Do their methods or priorities need to adjust to meet the challenges that we have presented in this event? So who from our panelists want to jump into giving some reflections about this? Alfred?
Yes, so I mean, this is I'm very happy for this particular question concerning the donors. You see, it's important that donors, especially climate funders, begin to internalize the risk and do their own due diligence. You know, a couple of years ago, many folks were concerned about engagement, advocacy, and campaign. And in fact, there was a situation where folks felt that there is a less adversarial, a much more safe way of trying to engage within the climate crisis. And they felt that those who were involved in, you know, transitional energy issues or renewable energy, and were in a way trying to, you know, to have a conversation with governments, were actually, you know, like in very safe zone. All of a sudden, we are seeing now that even those are facing reprisals and that the movement itself is under attack. But what I think many of the defenders that we are working with, including myself, have seen is that when the movement comes under attack, and I can point to many countries where this is happening across Europe, folks will tell you about that, in Poland, in France, in the UK, in India, in the Philippines, in Uganda, donors tend to take a step back because they are concerned about issue of liability. Now imagine this. If activists are putting their life on the line and defenders are being slaughtered at the rate of 4 a week, this is not the time for anyone to be thinking about their bottom line. We talk about a crisis. We talk about an emergency. So I really feel that in the most difficult, in the most challenging environment where defenders are taking risks, this is where donors need to put support. I've had consumer folks are saying, well, you know, we can engage in the MENA region, but this is the most climate significant region of the world. How come you can engage that? Where there's close civic space, where that's why we should engage. We should support those who are taking the highest risks. But what we see is the reverse, and I think we need to find a way to stop this, to really encourage donors to really put their money where they believe their values are. In those countries that are significantly impacting the climate crisis, producing more carbon emission, those countries where there's high restrictions and closing of civic spaces, so we can support those who are taking the greatest risk. And this is not what we see happening across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred. Christine?
So thank you so much. My intervention will look like this. And there is one thing that I wanted to put across that I forgot to put, especially in protecting Indigenous people rights. For example, security of their land tenure. To now, most states in Africa have not provided a framework to allow Indigenous people secure their rights, but they are in the international framework on issues of climate change and even doing a lot of negotiation. So some of this decision will affect our right. So basically what I'm trying to say is that it is unfortunate that communities have found themselves in the middle of carbon project. And of course they did not expect, and they don't understand. And the support is they need to be supported to understand their rights, to be able to negotiate on fair agreements. So issues to do with free, prior, informed consent. What are the levels? And that is the area that donors should take into account. Like, how do we support communities to engage in agreement? These are communities that decisions has been imposed to them. They didn't even want those agreements. But now that because it is getting their land and it is forming part of international discussion, we need to empower them to be able to understand their right, so that also they can be able to monitor those carbon projects, you know. Of course, in case of human rights violation, they be able to seek remedies that has occurred, including even what I've said to you about loss and damage. So such information is very crucial, and those are the areas that needs to be supported. So, of course, access to information has become a very barrier to carbon projects and climate financing, and often increase the risk of human rights abuse. And this is an area also very critical to Indigenous communities. So such issues need adequate kind of, preparation to Indigenous people, including even deliberate project targeting these people to be able to build their power from below. So thank you so much. And that is an area that I wanted to bring forward that I didn't mention. And of course, to the donors, that they need also to listen more to Indigenous people than to government who are negotiating on our behalf at international framework.
Thanks, Christine. Elisa?
Yeah, thank you very much. And this is a great opportunity to also reply to the other questions around the importance of creating, I think, funds and conditions for ongoing care for defenders, not just protection from attacks or after attacks. And this, I think, has to do with how we need to think about both climate funding, but also broader research funding, as really rethink that those projects as knowledge and solution co-production with human rights defenders, recognizing them as co-researchers, co-developer of those solutions, but also recognizing and providing specific funding for their own needs in terms of self-care and support, and equally, as Christine was saying, what their priority needs are beyond the development of those solutions. So like pre-existing systemic injustices that make their positions also more vulnerable. So really embedding in any climate funding, and also I think broader research funding, the recognition of defenders as knowledge holders and solution co-creators, having their needs specifically responded to. And in fact, I think there's a key role for funders to make those as binding conditions for, and eligibility even conditions for recipients. And I think the third point that needs to be built in is capacity building for those working with human rights defenders in being aware of their rights, their needs, their vulnerabilities, and learning how you work in solidarity with them. Because we can't just expect that, those relationships will be, there's a lot of, I think, misconceptions and misperceptions, and it's important to build the human rights capacities of those working in climate projects, and in fact, even research projects, to really be fair, helpful, and, genuine partners with climate defenders and human rights defenders.
Thank you, Elisa. Arzu?
Thank you. Can you hear me? I was just about to leave because I have another meeting, but just quickly on the donors, yes, I absolutely think that there must be a shift, especially when we think of the exodus of journalists and activists as a result of the crackdown. So supporting and kind of piggybacking of what Elisa was saying about supporting research, actually supporting independent journalism that's was forced to basically move out of the country, or independent media platforms that were forced to leave the country and set up independent newsrooms in third countries, so that they can continue investigating the extent of corruption, whether it has to do with the environment, whether it has to do with other spheres where the funding must be going but isn't from the state. So supporting independent journalism and investigative journalism ahead of COP for sure, and also really kind of shifting their mindset about, I think Alfred was talking about this sort of this emergency and the urgency of the civic groups and activists who are based on the ground, or continue, or have no other choice but to stay on the ground, and really kind of adjust their way of working with them, supporting them, assisting them when there really is a crisis, to develop a model that serves to prevent a crisis from happening potentially, rather than responding to a crisis after it happens. I'm really sorry I have to go, but it was really great being part of this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to the follow-ups.
Thank you, Arzu. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I have Emmanuel. And Emmanuel, I would love to hear your reflections on the donor questions, but I would also like to ask you to answer one of the other very, very important questions that is about the emotional and psychological support that defenders, their families, their communities, their children need, precisely because of the immense stress that they are going through. So please, Emmanuel, also help us with that question.
Yeah, I will try. So to the question of the donors, especially we have a lot to do with donors that donate for environmental policies and legal support in that realm. And we see a big need in shift or support, especially also against repressions, because only we can lobby, we can fight for stronger climate change efforts if we also still have those civic spaces. And if these civic spaces close, then the other money that is being donated cannot be effective anymore. And this is, I think, not yet realized by a lot of donors. Maybe a short overview. In Europe, we are connected with many states, and mostly it's volunteer work that help activists against those repressions. And we see from experiences, especially in Eastern countries in Europe, that if there's already established a network of civil organizations that know what to do when new repressions come, they can oftentimes stop those repressions and work effectively against those. And I think it is very important that we build that capacity now and that we support organizations that are willing to build those capacities and networks in each country. And I don't know any organization that already has efficient and enough capacities in any EU country. And therefore, the donors, I think, should think about supporting these. To the other question of psychological support and strains, I don't have that much of expertise in that field. However, we see that activists in Germany and in Europe, they are aware of that. We have the Psychologists for Future, for example, that try to support activists after actions, after repressions, and after all that psychological stress that they face. And that is, of course, not sufficient, because that is, again, volunteer work that is trying to support the activists, and also those psychological effects restrain and deter activists to go on with that important work. We see activists being able to be part of the movement for maybe a year, and then they cannot take more of that psychological harm. And that is something that we need to tackle, that we need to engage more in, so that we can support the activists for long-term actions, and we need them. And if they cannot handle the psychological pressure, that is a detriment for everyone.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Michael?
Yes, just a short word on donors. What I'm hearing from my consultations with defenders in many places is that we always invite the same people to come to our meetings, in fact, while they tell us that in many countries, those who are the most at risk are those living in remote areas, far from the capitals, who are never invited to attend meetings. So in addition to those who are, normally invited because they have the capacity, the expertise to attend COP meetings, we should also find a way to promote with donors the full participation of those who are the most exposed, local communities, indigenous people living far from the capital, and that also could also provide testimonies to governments when it comes to decision making. On the support to those defenders, there are currently good programs developed by NGOs to support, with psychologists and others, defenders that are living in very difficult situations. There's a big program promoted by Frontline Defenders in UK, in Ireland, sorry, in Dublin. We have also the York University in UK that has also a program to support defenders that are facing difficult situations. And there's a network also of universities that also promote the participation of psychologists to support defenders that are facing or needing psychological support when they are relocated elsewhere. And that's part of the relocation program to support also that part of the work of defenders.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much. And I'm mindful of the time. We are running over a few minutes, and thank you for our dear participants who remain in this wonderful event. Very difficult to hear all the presentations, the testimonies, the challenges that we are all confronting, but it's also very inspiring and moving to see how we can mobilize, how we can bring some alternatives and recommendations and solutions to the many challenges that we are facing. I really want to thank Elisa, Christine. We can see you now, Christine, on video. By the way, I didn't tell you. Arzu, who had to leave, Emmanuel, Alfred, Michelle, for joining us in this event and for taking the time to speak about all of these issues and the importance of participation, of freedom of expression, of freedom of assembly for our struggle for climate justice. Thank you very much. I want to thank Minority Rights Group for joining in the sponsoring of this event, to Stefania, who has been our dear partner in crime in bringing all this together, to my colleagues, Anne and Marta, for their support. Thank you, everyone. And we are going to be, it's recorded, and we are going to be distributing the recording, and hopefully with some interpretation, so that our participants can have access to this and can be distributed with other human rights defenders, climate activists, and environmental defenders. Thank you very much.
Thank you.